and good evening to you. When we decided that our last program for this month of Black History celebration would deal with African history, only 1/4 of the problem was solved. 3/4 of the problem included questions such as what person could do more than scratch the surface of this crucial and central part of world history, and finally, what person could bring the kind of enthusiasm to this topic that would hold your interest. Well, all arrows pointed to Egyptologist Dr. Yosef ben-Jochannan. Dr. ben-Jochannan is professor of history and Egyptology at Cornell University and professor of history at Temple University. Some of his books include Black Man of the Nile, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, and The Need for a Holy Bible. Dr. ben-Jochannan, what do we know about Africa as the birthplace of civilization?
I think most people know very little about it. However, if you look at Africa from numerous ways in terms of the birthplace of civilization, one has to go back into archaeology, into anthropology, and then next into theology. In the case of anthropology, we would have the oldest known fossil human, Zinjanthropus boise, which will take us to at least 1.7 million years ago. That would mean approximately 1.7 million years before Adam and Eve. If we look into archaeology, we can go back into looking at the buildings such as the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the places where the silt pyramids were first built, the movement of the Nile Valley in terms of the cataracts, and lastly, if we look from a theosophical point of view, we will have to go back into the teachings of the Africans and African gods and goddesses that predated Jehovah, Jesus, and Allah, and that would put us at least to the worship of Ta, P-T-A-H, subsequently the worship of Amen-Ra, A-M-E-N-R-A, and goddess Hathor, H-A-T-H-O-R, whom the Hebrews rather, copied and called the golden calf and the golden this and that, the other thing.
Sometimes you hear people say that Africa is not only the birthplace of civilization, but the birthplace of man. Would you address this, please?
Certainly. The oldest known fossil man found in Europe is called Neanderthal man, and it's only dated approximately 200,000 to 400,000 years of age. The next would be, they call it Pekin man or Java man. That would be dated somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years old. However, the oldest known fossil man will go back to some names they have not even been able to give yet, but Ethiopian man fossil will carry us back to approximately 3.5 million years. There is a Tanganyika fossil over 2 million years, and of course Zinjanthropus boise, which is at least 1.7 million years old, meaning then that the oldest known human fossil have been unearthed, dug up, in a place called Tanganyika, in an area called Ngorongoro Crater and Olduvai Gorge. Now, that is it. The oldest known human has been dug up in Africa.
I guess what I'm trying to get to is, you know, if all mankind was born in Africa, how do we account for the distribution throughout the world?
Well, number one, there is a common land bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Before the Suez Canal was dug by human beings in the 19th century, there was a land bridge there at the Sinai so that man could travel back and forth. However, the problem comes as to South America, and if you were to look at the landfall there, you'll notice that if you push Brazil, you can push it right into Ghana and the Bight of Benin there. Now, that's a theory, of course. However, we do know that man adapts to natural forces. The reason that black people have woolly hair and wide nose is very obvious. You need that in hot climates. You need a lot of area to take in air where it's very hot. The woolly hair stops the sun from burning down on you. Of course, the melanin, the deepness of the melanin also stops that preponderant amount of sun rays. As you go farther north and you get colder, you need less air, thus a smaller area for the oxygen to pass through back and forth. And you need straighter hair to stop the cold from penetrating to the sun, and you need less melanin, so that we could say that man adjusted to nature. We have that in animals. If you take the egg of a wild duck, let's say, the egg will be spotty. Take that wild duck 50, 100 years, that species, and what happened within the 100 years, the egg would be less spotty. Natural change of environment, man adapting to his environment.
When did Africa, or as you like to call it, Alkebulan, begin to show signs of high culture?
We can go back to at least a minimum of 700,000 BC. And then we are talking about the drawings in the Tassili Mountains of Sahara. We're also talking about the Siberian period, about 250,000 BC, Siberian the first, when the Africans were dealing with the Silk Pyramids. And then we come down to Siberian the second in 25,000 BC, when they started to deal with the hieroglyphs. And then 6,000 BC, when they started to refine, I should say 10,000 BC, when they start to deal with astronomy and develop the world's first calendar, the stellar calendar, and then refine that in about 6,000 BC, and in 4,100 BC they published the solar calendar with 365 and a quarter day corrected each 7th year, so that we could say that African high cultures, or civilization as Westerners would call it, goes back to at least 500,000 BC.
What was the racial composition of Africa, all right, when she began to show signs of high culture?
No doubt it looked like the black community in Columbia, South Carolina, or the black community in Harlem. In other words, it was black. Africa is the place where black people belong, came out of, and so forth. Of course, now a lot of people are going to claim it since the oldest human being found there, the oldest civilization, and now people are realizing what they had given away and called the darkest continent. So now everybody wants to reclaim it. Now, one has to remember that when we're talking about the oldest high cultures, the oldest civilization, there is nothing older than Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, and Puanit. By the way, let me place those places. Ancient Puanit was where modern Somalia, Kenya, and Uganda.
How you spell that?
P-U-A-N-I-T. The Jews later called it Punt, P-U-N-T, in the biblical writing. Then you had Ethiopia, or otherwise Aksum, A-X-K-H-U-M, which the Arabs call Habishistan, and the Persians call Abyssinia, and also Zanzibar, and the Jews in their mythology call Kush. Well, the high culture started there with a group of people called the Twa and the Hutu, who brought down that Nile all the way from Ethiopia, and the Nile goes down north, not up. North is the low part of that area, and south is the high. So when you talk about Upper Egypt, you're talking about the southern part, and Lower Egypt is the northern part. So I want that to get clear.
Okay.
And the Blue Nile, the beginning of the Nile, is in Uganda, and the White Nile is in Ethiopia, and they join at a place called Khartoum in Sudan. And then they meet at other body of water called the Atbara River, and then flow into the Kemet Sea, now called the Mediterranean. It is along that whole waterway that the indigenous Africans, and you heard my term, indigenous, the people native to that land, started their high cultures, building their pyramids, building their other systems of worship and so forth, until they reached down to Egypt, where the zenith took place, not where it began, but where it reached its zenith. And that, by that time that I'm talking about, there was no Adam and Eve yet. The story didn't exist because there was no Jew yet. Abraham wasn't born to start that story. There was no European history because Greece did not exist yet, the first of the European society. There was no Chinese history because this is the year 4,700, or the year of the rooster. There wasn't a single society in human history in existence other than those African societies.
When you begin to study African history, you invariably run into the term dynasty. What does this mean?
Dynasty is a period of rule. You can equate that with probably, say, the Yankees. The New York Yankees baseball team had a dynasty. They won the pennant for, let's say, 6 straight years. Then when someone defeated them, they took over the dynasty. That's a new dynasty. A dynasty could be 100 years. It could be one day. It could be whatever it is. For example, the longest dynasty in Egypt was the one in which Ramesses II was in, the 18th dynasty, because he alone ruled for 66 years and died at age 98. So that dynasty plus the others would make it the longest dynasty. There have been a dynasty for 3 months, where the pharaoh died in 3 months' time, and he was the only pharaoh of that name group, and that dynasty went out. So it's a period of rule.
What were some of the more significant, you touched on this already, achievements of the first 5 dynasties?
Oh, well, I could say in the first dynasty, the most significant thing, I would say, in terms of architecture and structure, it was the first time that man ever built a building of stone, and that was the time of Imhotep. He was the Grand Vizier, physician, architect, etc., for the Pharaoh Djoser, D-J-O-S-E-R, who was the 3rd pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, but there was something even more important than that. He started architecture. The building of the step pyramid of Saqqara, the first time that man placed his place for dying, his death, to go to the next world above the earth. And subsequent to that, to me, which was most important, the first time man established a set of moral values. This was, now I'm talking about 2785 BC.
Before Christ.
There was no Moses yet. Moses is not until 1346 BC. These Africans along the Nile gave to the world something called the Negative Confessions, 42 laws in which the so-called 10 Commandments were already written. For example, it says, I have not killed man, woman, or child. I have not made light thy bushel. I have not spoken with a false tongue. This is there. Now, Moses isn't born in Africa, in Egypt, yet. This is 2785. Moses is not until 1346. And now we hear something about Moses getting the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the first time man had laws. Moses himself, in that book, is said to be running from the Pharaoh, meaning Ramesses II, because he's supposed to have committed murder. And he didn't get the laws against murder yet, but somebody had a law against murder before Moses. And it is here, that was the most fundamental thing, a set of moral law, 42 of them, one for each nome. There were 42 states in Egypt. Each state was called a nome, N-O-M-E.
Okay. We want to get to the religious part of African history in another segment, but anyway, which of the dynasties were all black?
All of them, all the way up to the 13th dynasty, there was no such thing as a non-African person doing anything in any of those dynasties unless he might have been a visitor. The 13th dynasty, the first non-African people came in and conquered, smashed it. And that would be a group of people called the Hyksos from the Oxus River, which was a tributary that ran into the Tigris, which empties into the Persian Gulf, now called the Iranian Gulf. Those people came in 1675 BC, destroyed the 13th dynasty under the leadership of a man called Salatis. And subsequent to the Africans kicked them out under the leadership of Thutmose I. The next group of non-African people to come in there was not until the Assyrians under the leadership of Ashurbanipal. They came in when the Ethiopians were ruling Egypt, and that would bring us to 714 with Samarkand, Pianki, and others. They were relieved, then the Africans drove them out, and the Persians came under the leadership of, that was in 525, under the leadership of Cambyses. And Cambyses was replaced by Darius I. The African pushed them out, and for the first time came the Europeans, the Greeks, or Macedonian Greeks, under the leadership of Alexander, the son of Philip of Macedonia. That was in 332. And from that period of time to now, Africans have not ruled Egypt, but Egypt was already gone in its decline. They were followed by the Romans in 47, and replacing Cleopatra the Seventh. There were 7 Cleopatras. The one that most people speak about is the last one, Cleopatra the Seventh, the daughter of Ptolemy the 12th, who called himself Neosus Dionysus, which means the new Osiris. They went on until the beginning of the Christian era, which brought into about what is called the Byzantine period, and so forth and so forth. The Arabs came, the Ottoman Turks, then come the French, the British, the Germans. Everybody else walked in and did what they want. But everything you see there practically was already built by the Africans.
Okay, just to give us a more detailed flavor of what African life was like in ancient times, would you describe culture in early Africa, picking one or two countries, so far as family, the role of the father, the role of the mother, that kind of thing?
I think we need to go back into archaeology here, because we have to go back into the writings that's left. We can't presuppose something by some spiritual divine power, because it doesn't exist. We have to talk about the primary evidence, and the evidence is the writing that people left, because we can't go back and see them now. And the earliest drawings, hieroglyph, shows, number one, hunters with luminaires and whatnot. Then they showed a later development. They showed with various tools, weapons in which to kill animals. They showed constantly the bow and so forth, and a man catching an animal. And always they show a woman, or always the man had about 2 or 3 women with him. And then they would show children, indicating polygamy. They also show that the woman did all the farming mostly, the man did the hunting. They show the children doing gathering. So you could say that the family, the early family, was both an agricultural family as well as a hunter, and of course a gatherer. But way back there, those drawings back in 250,000 indicated already a knowledge of agriculture, because they were not only gathering, but they were also showing planting. That changes the whole presentation in universities of agriculture being no earlier than about 25,000 BC.
Okay. How much of an impact did Africa make on Greek culture?
Total. There was no Greek culture, no European culture, until the Africans carried it in there. The first and oldest Greek writing we have, anybody, this university right here in this city, any university in the world, cannot produce to you any piece of literature written anywhere in Europe before the Greek writing. And the first of the Greek writing is Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, Homer himself said that even the god Zeus and Apollo, Europe's first 2 gods, came from Ethiopia. The first time and Homer, we see him in Egypt getting his education, the first time we had to deal with the Greek. The so-called philosophers, the first Thales, Thales, we don't have him before the 600 BC. From Thales down to Socrates, the pre-Socratian philosophies, and from Socrates down to Aristotle, we see them all in Egypt and Nubia and later Ethiopia receiving their education. The Grand Lodge of Luxor in down south, I should say up south in this case, over 500 miles from the coastline into Egypt, we go there at the tombs and we find all the writings, all the recordings of those pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom that preceded. There was no European society yet, because the Greeks is the first, and we don't have Greeks until around 833, 1000 BC at best. So then when we're talking about ancient history, Greece isn't even mentioned. Now, all along there, the records show that the Greeks first arrived to receive their education. For example, we teach in the school, not we, but they teach in the school, that Hippocrates was the father of medicine. He isn't born until 333 BC. He comes to Egypt to learn medicine, to study the writings of Imhotep, who died in 2785, 2,500 years before Hippocrates was born. Hippocrates come to learn that man's medicine, and hundreds of others of his students to learn medicine, yet goes back, and now Western writing in this university or any other university tells you that Hippocrates was the father of medicine. We have when the Africans produced the first calendar, which the Greeks adopted, even the present calendar that we use comes from the African calendar. In 4100 BC, the African produced what is called the solar calendar, with 365 and a quarter days, corrected each 7th year. The Greeks adopted this. But the Romans had to come back to Africa and get an Ethiopian by the name of Ekbar to even change this calendar to 365 days corrected each 4th year. Even that. The mathematics, the science, it was Euclid who left Megara, North Africa, to go and taught the Greeks what is called Euclidean geometry. Lachman, whom the Greeks called Aesop, left Ethiopia to go to teach the Greeks. So that as we don't care where we see the Greeks, I think that Sibula said it best, out of Africa comes only gods. But that kind of information has been suppressed and not taught in the universities in the United States of America, except in now what you call black studies courses or African studies courses.
And for the people, got a question?
Yes. If this is so, then my question would be, what then is the purpose for the distortions in history as it is taught or today?
You can't say that the African people gave all these things I'm talking about and simultaneously justify slavery. You can't justify the nonsense that they're inferior. You have to take away the term darkest Africa. You would have to treat them in better thing, and you would have to suppress the origin. For example, even the Western concept now of university, it was the African calling himself Moor that went into Iberia and established the University of Salamanca in Spain, Europe's first university. So if you are to continue saying, if you got a Ku Klux Klan, and I don't mean the Ku Klux Klan is the only thing that's going to be racist, because the whole society is. But if, in order for you to have a Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan can't know, they couldn't justifiably have any reason to say that black people are inferior and thus don't want to sit down any place with them. And that doesn't go for the Ku Klux Klan alone. That's in the churches, in the mosque, in the synagogues. You got people who say that. Because then they will have to say that even the basis of their own religions come from there. If you talk about Christianity, started in Egypt, you know, we forget with Pantheus and Botis. Jesus was said to be born, and this isn't Christian, this is a historical thing. Jesus was said to be born in Ethiopia in a cave before at the Nicene Conference they changed it to a manger in Bethlehem. Judaism, the most prized character, Moses came from Africa, a place called Goshen in Egypt. That's what they said in their Bible. And you go all the way down, the first person in the Bible, Abraham, he comes to Africa, Egypt, to stop himself from starving to death, out in based upon their own story. The whole Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of them took their foundation in Africa. Now, if you're going to teach all these things, the Book of the Dead preceded the Old Testament by more than 2,000 years. If you teach these things, you got to stop practicing racism against African people. It's as simple as it is. So you got to suppress it.
Another comment, question?
More comment. No, it's a question. In terms of the 42 laws again, there's obviously a direct parallel in all of the other religions that you've mentioned. Can you be a little more specific on some of the other areas that there's a direct connection between, say, the Ten Commandments and some of the things that are detailed in the 42?
Let me cut in there and say that we will deal with religion in the next segment. Okay. Go ahead.
Could I ask a question about logic? That is, given the historical reality that you know of, would you would that suggest that there is a significant difference in the view of the world of people who are of Western European descent as opposed to people of indigenous African descent in terms of their system of logic?
Certainly. I could even take right the term Egyptology, which I carry as a professor. There is, in reality, there's no such thing. This is what is used in the West. There's Nile Valley civilization. Egyptology gives the assumption that Egypt had a unit of education that was strictly Egyptian and nobody else. That's where it reached the zenith. But this is a Nile Valley educational system that developed in the center of Africa and not at the outer end in Egypt. Another perspective is, what in the West, the world is seen from the West, from Egypt, from Greece. And all that is before Greece is cut off, or Judaism, all that is cut off there. And this, again, I must say, is not a religious position. Let me give you an example. If I said that I'm Jewish, which I am, everybody practically, most people practically, especially black people, will be surprised. How can you be Jewish and be black? Because they've been sold a bill of goods that there's such a thing as a Jewish race. There's no such thing. If a man could be black, he could be Christian, he could be Muslim, he could be Buddhist. There are such things. There are more black Jews in the world today than white Jews. You got the Kashim Jews from India, the Yemenite Jews from Yemen, and the Ethiopian Jews, my parents and myself, which is called Beta Israel. The Westerners call us Falasha. And we make up the majority of Judaism. We don't have the power. The white Jews from Europe and America. But then where did the white Jews, how the white Jews became Jews? Isn't it that Judaism went up into Asia, to Europe, and the vast majority of the Khazars converted into Judaism and created the bulk of white Jews? You got Jews who look like Swedes, Jews who look like Italians, Jews who look like me, you, anybody else. But the myth is sold here to create a myth of a race and call it a Jewish race. There's no such thing, no more than there's a Christian race. And that's what I'm saying. People see from different perspectives. You see based upon your background. Education is the perpetuation of a culture. That's what it is. All education in every country perpetuate the myths of that country and project even its racism. The school system was designed to perpetuate racism. That's the part of the society in which it is.
Would it be accurate to suggest in contemporary times that a significant difference in the logic between Western and African views of the world is that Western civilization's logic can be characterized as dichotomous, a kind of either-or logic, as opposed to an African logic.
All-encompassing.
All-encompassing.
Yes, we don't have an either-or. That's why in the law of opposites, which talks about the...
We're going to have to cut you right there and come back to that question. Sorry about that. You'll come back next week. Dr. Ben-Jochannan, thank you. That's our program. Good evening.